He didn't want to work on the damn deck. He couldn't concentrate worth shit, and he knew it. He'd end up smashing his thumb or fucking up his plans, which would require fixing the screw-up, and his patience was absolutely shot to hell. No, what he wanted to do was go out and see Lena. It was an edgy, burning need, one that crawled around under his skin and tore at him, ate at him. It was a hunger, a need, an ache, and one he had to listen to, or it would drive him insane. But he also knew listening to it was a bad idea. Bad idea, very bad idea, he told himself. Friends, remember? Just friends.
Yeah.
And as a friend, I can go out there and see how she's doing, right? I mean, after the weekend she had, what could it hurt, he muttered to himself. Trying to talk himself out of that idea, trying to cool the need, the fire in his gut, he decided to stop by the store. His last grocery store run, he'd been distracted, and without a list. Today, he was still distracted, and still without a list, but one thing he'd realized he needed was deodorant, so he made himself stop before leaving town. He made it halfway through the store, congratulated himself for not thinking about Lena. But as he stopped in the microscopic health and beauty section, crap, why did they put men's deodorant in the beauty section? He found himself in front of the display of condoms. Shit. 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 He did not need condoms for a friendly relationship. Once more, his focus was right back on her, and this time it had nothing to do with the strange mystery of the screams and everything to do with the shape of her mouth, the round curve of her ass, and the weird way he found his heart skipping when she stood close. The way he smiled when she laughed, and the way his chest ached when he saw that sad look on her face. It was almost like the way he felt when he'd first started dating Stacy Traynor back in high school, first major crush, that hot, fiery burn of young love. But the deal with Lena? It was worse. Way worse. Shifting his weight away from his stiffening right leg, he grabbed a box of Trojans and threw them in his handheld basket before stalking out of the aisle. Fine. So what? He'd bought a box of condoms, he was being practical. Nothing else. Just practical. Except he was having a hard time thinking about practical when it came to thinking about sex and Lena at the same time. It gave him the weird sensation of burning his brain cells, causing little microscopic implosions, and he could almost hear the neurons blowing up, one by one. In self-defense, he started thinking about something else, and the best way to distract himself was to focus on the puzzle. The screams. Not a car wreck. We pretty much know that, he muttered. There would have been records at one of the local hospitals, a vehicle, even just the sign of an accident, something. That was off the list. Missing person? Somebody had been kidnapped, maybe escaped only to be recaptured by her abductor? Problem with that line of thinking, in a town the size of Ash, if a person disappeared, people would notice, and he figured the sheriff would have mentioned it if somebody had fit that bill. Could be somebody not from around here, though, Ezra. Stopping in his tracks, he winced. That creaky voice was familiar. Normally, he would have welcomed it, but he really wasn't in the mood for the 30-minute distraction that was Lucy Wabash. Miss Lucy had been his grandmother's best friend, and Ezra had known her for as long as he could remember. When he'd come back home for his grandmother's funeral, Miss Lucy had sat in the front row, right next to him, and she'd held his hand, patted it as he tried not to cry. When he hadn't been able to fight it anymore, she'd whispered, "She was a fine woman, you know. Would be a shame if you couldn't shed a few tears for her, I think." She was, without a doubt, one of his favorite people in the world, and probably his favorite person in Ash, with the possible exception of Lena. But he really didn't want to talk to her just yet, especially not with the box of Trojans sitting right there in his basket. You're a grown man. 36 years old. The fact that she used to teach the Sunday school classes when you went to church with Gran doesn't change the fact that you're a grown man, he told himself. As she drew nearer, he angled the basket so the box of Trojans slid around. Score, they fell down and got lodged on their side, no longer quite so prominently on display. Hey, Miss Lucy. She shook a finger at him. Don't you hey, Miss Lucy me. You've been telling me for the past month you'd be coming by for a visit and you still haven't done it. What is your excuse this time? She sniffed. You went and forgot. She gave a theatrical little sigh. You young people, always forgetting about us older folks. Now, come on, Miss Lucy, chagrined, he shifted on his feet, feeling the same way he'd felt when she'd discovered him reading a comic book during her Sunday school class instead of paying attention. Grandma, leave Ezra alone. He's been busy, that's all. As her granddaughter came sauntering up behind her, Ezra managed to muffle his sigh of relief. Natalie was pushing along a mountainous cart of groceries, probably helping her grandmother get her monthly shopping done. She met his eyes and smiled. Don't pay attention to her nagging. It's just her way of showing affection. Lucy sniffed. Affection. Why should I show affection to a boy who can't even keep his word and come by to visit me? All he does is sit out there at his place and brood. The teasing light in her bright eyes faded, replaced by a serious, somber intensity. I hate to think of you just sitting out there, day after day. You're a young man, Ezra, you've still got your whole life ahead of you. Can't let that leg slow you down forever, you know. Natalie reached up and patted Lucy's narrow, stooped shoulder. Now, Grandma, you're meddling. She winked at Ezra and then added, besides, you're also slipping. Otherwise, you'd know that Ezra was out at the cafe yesterday, had breakfast with Lena Riddle, too. Lena, Lucy peered at him. She pursed her lips and then, a slow, pleased smile curled them. Lena Riddle. Oh, pretty girl, that one. Been living here 9 years now. She's a nice girl, too. Not afraid to work, and my goodness, she can cook. One good thing about a small town was how easy it was to find out information on a person. One mention of her name and Ezra had inadvertently ended up hearing a Reader's Digest version of her entire life. Only child, had been born in Ash, but her parents had decided to move to Louisville when she was young. Her father had died in an accident when she was 12. Went to school in Louisville, ended up graduating, and bought the house that used to belong to her parents, before they moved. She was a chef, of course, that fact he already knew, but now he knew her schedule, her specialties, and if he was smart, he'd ask her to whip him up some white chocolate, macadamia, and cranberry cookies. She took a break long enough to skim her list. Natalie, we're done, right? Yes, Grandma. And you told me once we had everything on the list, to make you get in line, you didn't want to do any of that evil impulse buying. She delivered that last line with a deadpan expression on her face. Ezra studied the heap of groceries in the cart, then glanced at the minuscule piece of paper Lucy held. You actually had all of that on the list? Oh, a lot of these are staples. Ezra craned his head and studied the neat little stack of paperbacks tucked in the front part of the basket. Books are staples? She arched snow-white brows. Books are one of the most important staples. And you mind your own business about the groceries, and I won't mention that personal item I saw in your basket. Blood rushed up his neck. He was not blushing. No way in hell had an 80-year-old woman managed to make him blush over a damn box of condoms. Natalie gave him a look of sympathy. She's got eyes like an eagle. They keep saying eyesight is one of the first things to go when you get older, but I swear, her eyesight gets better. My hearing is just fine, too, Lucy said smartly, marching ahead of them toward the lines. So, Lena Riddle, Ezra? Is she the reason you haven't come by to visit? This could be a landmine, he decided. Lucy wasn't a gossip, exactly, but she heard things. If he let her assume he was dating Lena when he wasn't. Shit. This woman was like Supermom or something. She had the ability to make him feel like a teenager, sneaking outside after curfew. And he'd only done that like twice. We're not dating or anything. Just friends, he said, blowing out a sigh. A nice girl, you could do a lot worse, you know. I haven't talked to her much, mind you, but she seems to be quite a nice girl. After all, Natalie likes her. Natalie smiled at her grandmother. Lena's a sweetheart. Lucy inspected the contents of Ezra's handheld basket and shooed him in front. You go first. You've only got a few things there. Then she winked at him. And it's not like you have to hide your purchases, after all. Courtesy demanded he decline. But then he looked at Lucy's heaped basket. Forget courtesy. Besides, he really would rather get out of there before she decided to strike up a conversation regarding his purchases. If you don't mind? She beamed at him. If I minded, I wouldn't have offered, now would I? Natalie, didn't Lena date Remy for a while? I think so, Natalie said, her voice distracted. She was scanning the magazines on the rack, nibbling her lower lip. If you're talking about Lena Riddle.
Yeah.
She dated Remy. Almost a year, I think. That came from the cashier. Natalie and Lucy didn't look at all surprised, and Ezra stood by, a little bemused as the woman jumped feet first into the conversation. A few people were talking like it was kind of serious, and then they just stopped going out. Never did hear why. Ezra frowned as he tried to place the name. Once he did, the frown threatened to turn to a sneer. Remy Jennings.
Yeah.
He knew that name. The pretty boy lawyer he'd met in the sheriff's office that day, and he was more than a little disgusted to think of the pretty boy putting his hands on Lena. Remy Jennings, who might or might not be related to the kid who had been driving all over his property, too, an issue he had agreed to let go, he remembered. Scowling absently, he dumped his stuff on the conveyor belt as the cashier decided to prattle on, at length, sharing all she knew about Lena. She knew quite a bit. As far as information went, the woman had it nailed. She knew how often Lena had her dog to the vet, to the groomers, how often she went into Lexington, how often she went to Louisville. Her brother-in-law had done some contract work out at Lena's place, and how it was just plain odd that a blind woman would choose to live so far out in God's country when she could be living back in Louisville. Maybe she likes living in God's country, he said when the cashier stopped to take a breath. I don't see why. I mean, it's not like she can drive herself into town or anything.
Yeah.
Because driving into town is of the utmost importance in everybody's life, Ezra said. She just blinked at him, looking vaguely confused. He took advantage of that to push the money for his stuff into her hands and make a break for it. He needed to get the hell out of there before he did something really humiliating, Like pry for more details about this so-called relationship between Lena and Remy Jennings. Man, he had it bad. Deputy, did I ask you what your thoughts were about that complaint? The sheriff kept his voice mild. Nielsen wanted to make absolutely sure that Prather got this message. He was still pissed off. He'd kept it hidden well, he knew, but Detective Ezra King's visit had not started his day off in a good manner. He'd made a few calls and discovered pretty much what he'd expected to discover. King was a good cop. Had a bad case 6 months earlier and could have died. It was the sort of case that could break a good cop. Could break a person. King hadn't broken, but only time would tell if he could go back to the job or not. Having a good cop in here, telling him about one of his own cops, a lousy fucking cop, set his teeth on edge, but it only made it worse because King wasn't wrong. Prather wasn't dirty, but he sure as hell wasn't a good cop. He also didn't know how to control his temper worth shit. He glared at Nielsen with eyes that all but glowed with all the anger he had trapped inside him. Nielsen wished, just once, the man would let some of that anger slip, in his direction, of course. If he could put it in writing that he felt Prather might prove a danger, he could boot the bastard out. But Nielsen couldn't do it just because he didn't like the bastard, and the man hadn't crossed the line in any way that could get him fired, either. "What is the problem, Sheriff?" Prather asked, his voice stiff and level, despite the rage that had his face red and snapped in his eyes. "My problem is that we had a civilian call with a valid concern and you did everything but shove her out the door when she came in to discuss it." "A valid concern?" Prather snapped. "She didn't see anybody, she can't see anybody. She heard something and nobody else heard it." "Nobody fucking believes a word." "I do," Nielsen said, his voice cool, quiet. Yelling at buffoons like Prather might make him feel a little better, but he'd learned a long time ago, those buffoons listened better when he didn't yell, and there was something about a cool, quiet voice in the face of temper that just unnerved people. "She's not a quack, she's not a flake, and if she claims she heard a woman screaming, and very explicitly details the screams, the words, and even the direction and general area of the screams for my deputies, then I'm more inclined to believe her. This isn't like the crock of shit reports Deb Sparks calls in, just to get one of us out there." Then he leaned back in the chair and pinned his deputy with a direct stare. "What's more, Jennings feels there's something odd going on. As does the state cop you insulted when he was here. You're making an ass of yourself on this, and you didn't just insult a civilian, you also insulted a fellow law enforcement official. Are you trying to cause me problems, deputy? Or is it just natural?" Prather's chin rose a notch. "What does it matter if King believes her or not? It's not like he's out here investigating anything. He's on leave." "You're so damned stupid." Nielsen resisted the urge to pinch the bridge of his nose. He'd woken up with a headache. It was a sign, he realized, a sign that today would be a crap day and nothing else. That headache had only gotten worse as the day went on. When Prather came swaggering in just before 2, the headache had grown to gargantuan proportions. The bastard was an insult to his uniform, and every year that passed, he just got worse. Taking a slow, calming breath, he focused on Prather's face and said, "No, Detective King isn't out here on an official investigation, but then again, that's not going to keep him from poking around if he decides to poke around, is it? He ain't got no fucking reason to poke around." Nothing happened. As if Prather hadn't said a word, Nielsen continued, "Not that I much care for having some state big shot messing with my territory, but then again, considering he's gone and developed an interest in Ms. Riddle and you were about as insultingly rude as you could get, How could I expect him to do otherwise? Prather's face went pasty white, then back to ruddy red, all in the span of 5 seconds. Now listen here, Sheriff, if that woman is claiming I acted improper somehow, she is lying. Did you tell her she should consider getting a live-in companion? Prather gave a restless, jerky shrug. And how is that insulting? Gently, using the same tone he used when explaining something to a 5-year-old, Nielsen said, "She's blind, Prather. She can't see, but she's not mentally challenged, she's not helpless. She has a rather demanding, chaotic career, which she manages to handle without a companion. She's lived on her own here for quite a while, and I do believe I've heard she's a college graduate. That doesn't sound to me like somebody who needs to be on the receiving end of companion services." Prather just blinked. He really didn't get it. Rising from his chair, Nielsen leaned over his desk, hands braced on the surface. "You don't get it. I can't make you get it, even if I paint it on a billboard. Yet you seem to think she's the one who needs assistance," he muttered, disgusted. Why in the hell did he have to continue putting up with this? The story wasn't moving, and hadn't been for about the past week. Plain and simple. Law tried to figure out if the problem was the story or him. He had too much shit on his mind, there was no doubt about that. Maybe that's all it was, and he certainly hoped that was at least part of it, because he'd spent the past 6 months working on the current book, and if it turned out the book was the damn problem, then he had a major damn problem, because there was no way he could start from scratch and still meet his deadline. Law didn't miss deadlines. Period. Blowing out a breath, he stared up at the ceiling, absently throwing an old baseball up, catching it, and then tossing it up again. Over and over. He let his mind drift and hoped that it would settle on whatever was blocking him. And to no surprise, it wasn't the book. He found his thoughts torn between two women who meant a lot to him. Lena, a woman he adored, and Hope, one of his dearest friends. Worry for the two of them ate at him. Hope should be here by now and she wasn't. She'd said she'd be here within the week and that was 6 days ago. She was stalling, he knew that, and he even understood. She had given him her word and she wasn't here. Hope didn't break promises. He'd have to call her if she didn't show by nightfall, because this worry just wasn't going to go away. He knew she was a grown woman and if she'd decided not to come, there wasn't anything he could do about it. But, shit, what if that bastard ex of hers had tracked her down? Hope insisted it wasn't likely, but Law knew all about obsessions, and Joey had one major, hard-on obsession for his ex-wife. She'd walked away from him and Joey hadn't ever been one to handle people walking away well. And Lena. Ezra. Shit. Not that he'd seen anything to say otherwise, but Law knew it was only a matter of time before the cop decided to forget the "just friends" bit. He could tell by the way Ezra looked at her that he didn't think friendly thoughts about Lena. Jealousy ate at him, but the part of him that needed to see her happy, well, his gut told him the cop might be able to do that for her. Aside from the jealousy, though, there was worry, and he couldn't deal with worry as easily as he handled jealousy. Law was, by nature, the suspicious type. Even when he'd been a kid. He'd had conspiracy theories running wild in his head before he even understood the concept. It was probably why he did so well writing suspenses. He was one of those who always saw the sedan in his mirror as one that might be following him, and even when he wasn't speeding, he always watched the cop cars in his rearview mirrors, certain they'd turn around and pull him over for something. Conspiracy theorists are us. He was a card-carrying member. Or at least, he might have been, but he was a little too normal for most of the conspiracy theorists, they drove him bonkers. Sometimes, actually, all too often, his imagination got a little carried away. But something hadn't felt right in the woods by her place when they'd been out there earlier in the week. He couldn't figure out the right way to describe it, but something hadn't felt right. Heavy. Oppressive. The right kind of atmosphere for a woman, hell, anybody to scream desperately for help. Not that they'd found anything. At all. And King had looked, and looked. And looked. Abruptly, Law straightened in his seat and bent over his computer. Pulling up the browser, he went to Bing and keyed in Kentucky plus missing persons plus females. Then his eyes widened as he saw all the names. Whoa. Okay, so this was local and fairly recent. Let's try giving it a few days. That cut down on some of the results. But still so many. Absently, he clicked on one. It was a woman, but her disappearance was too far back, he figured. Carly Watson. Missing for 6 months. Long time. More than likely, if she was still alive, she was just living the good life under a different name. It happened sometimes, he knew. He'd even written a book about a woman who'd gone and done just that. It hadn't been published yet, but he'd started it after he'd done the research on how Hope might be able to disappear, if that was what she'd wanted. Closing out the page on the article on Carly Watson, he went back to the search results. Needed to narrow it down more, he figured. Wondered if he could do it by location. The doorbell rang. He rose, padding on bare feet across the polished hardwood floors. He had hopes that it would be Hope, but still, he wasn't exactly expecting it to be her. That made it a double surprise when he opened the door to see her standing there. A slow, hesitant smile curled her lips and she went to hold out a hand. A handshake, Hope, he asked. When he held out his arms, she launched herself at him. Though they had kept in contact, it had been years since they'd seen each other and Hope wasn't sure how she'd feel when she saw Law. But the moment his hazel eyes met hers, all the fear, all the nerves and anxiety melted away. As his arms closed around her, she settled against his chest and let herself breathe. She felt safe. She hadn't felt safe when a man touched her in a good long while, and she hadn't realized it could still happen. But it could. Pressed against Law's chest, his hand gently cradling the back of her head, she sighed in tension she'd held in check for years slowly began to drain out of her body. Suddenly, she was no longer questioning why she'd come. She remembered now. Because it was Law. Because this was her dearest friend and this was the one person on God's green earth she knew she could trust. Sniffling, she squeezed her eyes closed against the tears that threatened. You took long enough, he said teasingly.
Yeah.
I think maybe I took too long, she said, her voice hoarse and rough. A couple hours later, they sat down in front of a huge flat-screen TV with Lord of the Rings playing. There was a half-eaten pizza in front of them. Law had a beer, she was drinking a Diet Coke and she felt almost normal. With their backs braced against the couch, she tried to focus on the movie, but she couldn't. Her mind wouldn't settle. It felt odd, she realized, being in a house, being with another person, a friend. For the past 2 years, the only people she'd let herself be around had been strangers, safer that way, she had thought. Easier. But maybe she hadn't needed to stay away from Law.